Boris Johnson is facing severe pressure from many quarters as he charts a path out of lockdown from the coronavirus pandemic. He faces pressure from businesses that are dying to reopen, from parents who are sick of homeschooling their children, and most worryingly for his premiership, he faces significant pressure from his own backbenchers. They're surgical in their approach, they're highly organised, they are actually inflicting defeats and forcing U-turns on the government. On December the 1st, Boris Johnson faced the biggest revolt of his premiership yet. This was over his tiers policy, which backbench MPs argued was badly targeted, far too authoritarian, and they claimed was not based on sufficient scientific evidence.
The noes to the left, 78.
Some 53 MPs rebelled against the government, forcing Boris Johnson to have to rely on the Labour Party to get the policy passed.
So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
This was a particularly damaging revolt for Boris Johnson, given that he had personally appealed to MPs. He'd been in the tea rooms, he cajoled them in the voting lobbies, he even held Zoom calls. So the fact that so many went against it was really a damaging indictment of his authority. The key group orchestrating this revolt was the COVID Recovery Group. They're a group of Conservative MPs led by Mark Harper, who himself, as a former Chief Whip, is incredibly well experienced in corralling his colleagues. The deputy chairman of this group is Steve Baker, who used to head up the European research group of hardline Tory Eurosceptics. Now, they had a huge success in the last parliament, heaping pressure on Theresa May and ultimately bringing about her downfall. So these are kind of players who are to be reckoned with. They're not people that the government can easily ignore. He needs to convince those lockdown skeptics in the COVID Recovery Group that his roadmap out of the pandemic lockdown is fast enough and will return society to normal at an early enough date. The legislation currently underpinning the lockdown expires at the end of March, so the race is now on to convince those MPs to back his plan before we have the next parliamentary showdown.
All we need to do now, Mr. Speaker, is to hold our nerve until these vaccines are indeed in our grasp and indeed being injected into our arms.
In December, we saw the government manage to get its policy through despite the biggest revolt of Boris Johnson's premiership so far. He may not be so lucky next time. The CRG is one of many Tory tribes that have emerged in this parliament. We've also seen the Northern Research Group spring up. Those are MPs across the red wall seats in the North and Midlands who want to heap pressure on Boris Johnson to stick to his levelling up agenda. You've also got the Veteran Support Group. They want to see more action taken to protect veterans of the Troubles in Northern Ireland who face repeated reinvestigation and potentially prosecution. Then you've got the Common Sense Group. They don't want to see asylum claims granted to migrants who've travelled through safe European countries to reach England. Even foreign policy comes into it, and in fact there are two rival groups on China. The first, the China Research Group, is led by Tom Tugendhat, head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. The second group, led by Ian Duncan-Smith, the former Tory leader, is the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. The interesting thing about how these Tory tribes operate is that they're increasingly sophisticated. They organise via WhatsApp groups so they can communicate directly, but some of them even have parliamentary funding for proper secretariats, sophisticated operators who have experience in public relations and can help get their cause into the press, as well as people who know the mechanics of the arcane rules of Parliament.
It leaves us then with a problem because the government's asking us to vote on these measures not knowing whether they're proportional.
An important thing to note here is that these aren't just groups of angry and discontented backbenchers. They are actually inflicting defeats and forcing U-turns on the government. So far, we've seen the government have to change course on the role of Huawei in the UK's 5G rollout, on the role of English courts in deciding whether China has been involved in genocide against the Uyghurs, on free school meals, and on planning reform. It's a pretty damaging position for Boris Johnson to be in, given that he's only just over a year into his premiership so far. There are two key reasons we may not see quite such a loyal Conservative Party this early on in the administration. The first is that the Conservatives have been in government for more than a decade now. This means that there are many old-timers on the Conservative benches who've already had their spell in government. They've already had the big cabinet, big beast posts and other ministerial positions. And some of these MPs feel there isn't much chance of preferment anyway, so there's no point in being loyal. The stakes aren't that high for them. On the flip side, you also have a large new cohort, But the pandemic's meant they haven't learnt the ropes in the normal way. They haven't been guided by more senior MPs. They haven't had as much interaction with the party. And therefore the normal loyalty that is inbred in new MPs hasn't really applied. As one senior Conservative said to me just last week, there's a real sense in the party that MPs are grumpy and disconnected. And it's in that stage when people can start to organise behind the scenes without feeling the stiff hand of discipline that often comes to play when people are on the parliamentary estate and having to face the whips in person.
But what we're saying is that this is the moment to make that big, long-term stake, that backing of Britain.
The problem the government faces is that the pandemic has already taken up a year of parliamentary time. The clock is now ticking down until the next election, and the government needs to act at breakneck speed to get through a packed policy proposal suite in order to show voters that it has delivered on what it promised at the last election. If these specialist interest groups and Tory tribes keep pulling in opposite directions, however, the government is really going to struggle to get through its policy proposals and live up to its promises at the last general election.